Hi everyone, today we're going to be going over just a personal pipeline of mine about how I go from SketchUp to Twinmotion, and in doing so, then transfer that over to layout for drafting. So it's a little bit of like how to use A to make B and C, because we're only using one kind of main software to then dictate to our other two pieces of software what we want our final product to look like. This won't be a super detailed example of how to use Twinmotion, SketchUp, or layout. I'm really going to be talking about fairly basic level concepts. I'm really sort of just assuming that you already know how to use these three. This is just how I've developed my pipeline to get from A to B to C. Because I'm not really going to be spending a lot of time going over how to make custom graphics for things, how to set up your scenes. I'm not even going to talk about how to draft something or set up lighting in a scene. Someone who's interested in those things, then, by all means, then go out and pursue all of those concepts later on after the video. And feel free to watch it double the speed in case you really just want to get through this and see if there's anything new that he's teaching me. So starting off, I just want to go over a little bit of a perspective about me, just so we can all understand where I'm coming from. And if you are in a different design field or discipline, then you know that this may not be applicable, but things can translate. So first off, my name is William Anderson. In case you're watching this somewhere else other than my site, I'm a freelance scenic designer based out of New York. I mainly work in live theater, film, TV, stuff like that. I am a member of 829, and I've worked freelance for the past 5 years or so. Rarely ever in a team over 5 people, but there was a brief stint where I was a production manager where teams would fluctuate and stuff like that. I'm not an architect. This is not an architect's perspective on things. And again, just if you're in another design discipline, sometimes the skills transfer. So just keep that in mind. This is very much so how I work as a freelancer, but I have modeled this off of different workflows that I've picked up over the years from people that have worked around me. I'm not the best speller. You may find some typos in this presentation, so please just keep them to yourselves. I'm not the best, so just putting that out there. Also, I'm not a teacher. The highest degree I have is a BFA, so I don't really feel qualified to teach people, but if you learn something from this, then hey, that's amazing. And just briefly before we get into this, I just want to point out that we are largely an industry of freelancers, and oftentimes personal equipment or just equipment in general comes at one's own personal financial expense. So some people just might not have access to the same hardware as you, and in turn that might not allow them to work on the same projects or as well learn. So again, the stuff we're going to be going over today is fairly resource heavy, and unless you have a computer capable of handling these tasks, it's going to be very difficult for people to want to learn and also work on these projects. So just keep that in mind. Now, for my logic for making this, maybe you learned something you didn't know. Who knows? Everybody likes to learn, or we should all be learning. And remember, we don't know what we don't know. So even if you're watching this and you're like, this is why the hell is he doing it this way? Just keep that in mind as well. That some people, it may seem obvious, but to others, it's not. And also, I get asked this question a lot, so this is kind of just me hoping to always or have a perpetual answer to this question of how I do things. And I hope this does answer any questions that you may have if you've clicked on this video without having known me first. So, great, let's get into it. So, for the outline, I'm just going to go over a pretty early design process, just fairly loose, just so that people who aren't in this field know or are in others fields that they can still understand where we are. Just kind of a breakdown of some of the roles, some basic file formatting for our file structure and how we house all of our different elements from different pieces of software to files we export to stuff that we're sharing with the relevant people, like your designer, your client, people who work for the venue, carpenters, fabricators, shops, stuff like that. And finally, we're going to go just how to set things up in SketchUp that will allow layout in Twinmotion to read things fairly easily. And I mean, luckily we don't have to do almost any exporting because both Twinmotion and layout read SketchUp files just natively, so we're good to go. Also, in case it hasn't been said, layout comes with a SketchUp license, so it's, I don't want to say free, but I mean it's something you're already paying for if you have SketchUp. I myself am a fairly big AutoCAD user, but when I'm not working on like a large project, I'll use layout just because I think it's a bit easier just to go through, and I mean it's also a lot cheaper, so keep that in mind. So keeping this brief, just the early design process is something that can vary depending on your field. I've tried to lay it out from your perspective if you work for the designer, or maybe you are the designer. But so first off, we've got the client and the venue. I've lumped these two together just because sometimes they are the same person, but other times they're two different entities. But this is really just where you're going to be keeping location information, budget, contracts, just information about the show that you want your team or yourself just to have access to easily, but you don't want to clutter your main kind of file for where you're storing things. Next, we've got the designer. This can be you, sometimes it is you. And from them, you'll mainly be looking for sketches, research, and just understanding the scope of what is going to be asked of you. Sometimes you don't even need to get into Twinmotion. Sometimes you can just do a quick hand sketch and a drafting and bang a project out. It all depends on what they need from you and what you're able to deliver. But you also want to keep in mind that there are other people down the pipeline that may want to go into Twinmotion, in which case you may want to take these steps. Finally, when you do understand what it is that's asked of you, just know it takes time to go from program to program and maintain a cohesive image or final design. This isn't something that you can just bang it together last minute. You've really got to manage or know what you're being paid for, essentially, and if it really is something that's worth your time. Very briefly, if you hear it clicking in the background, it's my radiator just turning on. It's the middle of the winter right now, so just sorry for the clicking. Finally, we come to you. How do you fit into this? What is it that you're looking to accomplish and deliver? You want to start big, just then get small, like give really broad sketches, and then go back in later and really finesse those details. Start naming things early as well, and stick with them. I know it might get annoying to call something like brown chair in the beginning, only to realize that it turns into something else. But for file management's sake, you may just want to stick with what you've originally put down. And lastly, get it set up early. This can help you later on. It always helps me just to spend like the night before really going in and just kind of naming things for what I know I'm going to need later on. So first up, we have just a basic file setup in that kind of long gray box. I have just exploded our basic outline for how things not necessarily need to be structured, but how I just have things broken up by not necessarily file type, but by program type. So at the top, we've just got our main kind of root file. Then next up, we've got our publishing file. We'll touch on all of these later on. Then we've got SketchUp, Twinmotion, layout, and then any other sort of software that you may have. Again, we're only going to touch on SketchUp, Twinmotion, layout. And then below that, we've just got stuff from the designer and from the venue. For some of these, it may seem obvious, but again, just kind of stick with me so that we're all on the same page. And I'm going to go in order of how these might be received or planned out. Keep in mind that not all of these are going to be viewed by the same people. I mean, you not necessarily wouldn't even want all of them to be viewed by the same person. And lastly, try not to name files like final, really, this is it, trust me, it's the last time, final file. Try saying that 10 times fast. We want to keep our main file clean and void of any kind of clutter. If you do have a dump file, like I have one on my desktop, that's where you should be storing files like that. Just remember, we want to keep our library clear, This isn't just for you, it's for anyone else. And I mean, additionally, it's for you, but future you, who may not be in the same mindset as you were when you made all of this stuff in the first place. So up first, we've got our published files. These are very finished products. They're stuff that you might be pushing out in an email, but you want to store somewhere so that they can be accessible via a link or a QR code or somewhere else that they're stored online, either through like a Dropbox or a OneDrive or another kind of file hosting service. This will be a place for general access. Most of these things will probably already be printed and distributed to the proper parties or people involved. But I mean, you just want to keep stuff that you have finished and you know you've finished separate from stuff that your draftsman might be working on or printing out and showing you for final approval. I personally like to sometimes print out little QR codes that I can then put onto my drawings or draftings. This way, if someone thinks that they have something that's out of date, they can always scan it and it'll take them to the relevant folder that has things that are up to date. Additionally, if they're missing a page or they've lost a couple of things, then they can find everything else that they need to. The old and archive folder, it's not something you need to include there, but I like to have it just so that I know what's been published and what people have seen. Before I put anything in there, I just like to put a date in front of it. This way it doesn't conflict with anything later on, and I can just throw stuff in there as I need it. And set this one up first. This way you can give links and set proper authority for reading as soon as possible so that they know that if they are ever concerned that something might be out of date, they can open that link or scan a QR code to then be directed to the relevant information. And I don't have it shown, but some people like to have a log or list of things that have been published. Just a list of names and dates so that they know that on this day, so-and-so did in fact publish and share this set of drawings or renderings or whatever it is that was published. So now moving on to the client and venue. Again, sometimes these can be two different entities, but for the sake of this demonstration, I'm just going to lump them together. Here, you'll just have stuff that they give you, like site information, draftings about the spaces that are involved, insurance forms, vendor contracts, site photos, stuff like that you'll want to have or be allowed to share with your team. Again, you don't want the stuff getting lost in an email. You want it somewhere that's easily accessible. And this might go without saying, but you're not really sharing stuff in here with a wider audience. This is just for in-house production so that people know that production relevant materials are present somewhere. And additionally, so that they don't have to spend time or waste time digging through their own email or someone else's email, where countless projects may be in development or just kind of loosely scattered about. I don't know about you, but my inbox tends to look a bit crazy. So up next, we have stuff that you might get from the designer. Again, this might be you, just depending on the project. And this is really artwork or reference material that they would be sending to you that you would then transfer over into any model work or Photoshop, Twinmotion, SketchUp, things like that to be used in the design. So you'll want to name what these things are. I know naming your research is never fun, same thing with sketches, but it'll help you later on with keeping track of ideas and just so that people who may not have been a part of the conversation can still find things that may resemble chicken scratch. I think everybody has a couple of sketches like that. And just remember, no sketch is too small or too ugly or too unrefined. They really do go a long way in the production process with fleshing out ideas and maintaining a cohesive image that other artists can look at and then reference and then iterate on. So before we jump into SketchUp, I just want to clarify one thing, that published files, stuff from your client or the venue and from your designer, these three files can vary greatly depending on the production and depending on your design discipline. I just wanted to present them so that we were all on the same page just about what it is that people may be giving you and how that may influence the design process for whatever it is that you're doing down the line. So up first with SketchUp, we're going to touch briefly on the fact that I have two main project files. I like to do this just because I like to break up my scenes by a storyboard and then have another file set up for all of my drafting, which I then import over into layout. Because, and in these two, I'll call them high-level SketchUp files, I don't actually do any modeling. I'm really more placing different components around that build up the larger design, right? Because further along the design process we go, the bigger the file tends to get. So we want to try and find a way or work with SketchUp to manage the workload that we're giving the computer at any given time. So by having our elements broken up by components that we're saving somewhere else, it allows us to work on specific things in a more time-effective manner. And it also allows individuals to work on the same file, though in different ways. Like I could have my storyboard artists fleshing out different scenes in a show, while my draftsman's still able to go in and select different views that they need to display different elements. I'm not really going to get into the specifics of drafting or storyboarding, but again, breaking things up just to make things easier to work on. Lastly, you may also have just a ZZ or old folder where you can stuff old models and things like that you're no longer working on, but I just always like to have a copy. Just remember, stick a date on it before you send it off to the Shadow Realm. So, going off of our idea of just having a bunch of different components that we're loading into our main file, really think about these main files as like very hungry hippos, right? They're eating a bunch of things, or alternatively, you can look at it like nesting dolls, because we're using our main file or very high-level file to store and organize all of our scenic elements. And in doing so, depending on how well we break these things up, can really influence our process or how much time we spend in Twinmotion later on. And I know there really isn't a one-to-one translation for breaking things up depending on the project. You've really got to understand the design and know, like, later on, am I going to want this in 2 pieces or am I going to want this in 4 or just 1? So once you've got all of your components, right, it's going to start resembling your Twinmotion outliner later on down the line. Really think of this as your foundation. And just so you know, you can put components inside of components. Just make sure that you're organizing things correctly. Like if you've got, take the illustrated example of component G, right? We've got that high-level component with a bunch of other ones feeding it other information. And we can really work on these in almost whatever order that we want. Like let's say I was back in the storyboard main work file. I could make a modification to component A and then save over it in the components file and vice versa. So just make sure that you're keeping these things organized and your workflow can really benefit. And since Twinmotion, or since we're not exporting anything from SketchUp to Twinmotion, but rather reading the raw file, there really isn't a whole lot of organization needed for, let's say, if it's an OBJ or an STL or an FBX. We can just kind of keep our organization as our hierarchy. Just as a reminder, this isn't the Warhammer universe. We don't need to be dogmatic about all of this. Whatever creative process works best for you, works best for you. Right? Like, let's say you've got a bunch of different finials on a staircase. You don't need to save those out. Those can just stay in the staircase file. So up next, we've got textures or materials. In here, you may find just normal maps, color maps, occlusion, metallic maps, things like that that help you define what an object is supposed to look like in a specific kind of software. This in itself could be a video or an essay all on its own, but right now what I really want you to just take away from this is that I like to store these next to where the original object came from. So if I've got a door, inside of that SketchUp or Blender or Maya file, I'll have the materials folder with that relevant texture data. And since we're talking about SketchUp today, when you assign a material to an object, you're really assigning a texture ID to a face of geometry, like a brick texture, but try not to think about it so much by visual, but by the name of that texture. Because anything that has that name as its texture ID is then going to take the new material when we import it into Twinmotion. And I should stop saying import. We're really just reopening our SketchUp file. Another thing to keep in mind is also the texture ratio. Let's say I have a square texture and I apply it to a wall. I can then set the dimensions of that texture to be 4 feet by 4 feet, or 3 feet by 3 feet, or 2 feet by 2 feet. But what's something that all of these textures have in common is that they're all square ratios. And when I go to reassign their texture ID in Twinmotion, all of these materials are going to appear square or normal. They're not going to look stretched. But let's say I have a unique texture with some graphics on it in SketchUp, and that texture ratio is like 4 by 1 foot 3 and 5/8. So that texture ratio is going to be 4 by 2.5. So when we reassign that texture ID, it's going to appear squished or stretched. In this case, Twinmotion has some built-in texture remapping abilities that we'll touch on later on. But just for now, know that this isn't too big of a problem. And I mean, if you do have some custom textures that you want to re-import, just keep those Photoshop files or design files handy so that you can separate out relevant information that we can then reapply as a decal somewhere else. So lastly, I've just got exports. This isn't something that we're going to touch on too much just because we're really not doing a whole lot of exporting. Right, we're really just reopening SketchUp files in different pieces of software. But I mean, if you are exporting certain objects, let's say you need to go into AutoCAD or Vectorworks or another 3D modeling software, this is where you would want to store those objects, images, or DWGs. So up first with layout, we're just going to talk about some high-level files you may have. If you've got a table of contents, this is where you'll want to keep it. It can be an Excel sheet, Google Docs, whatever it is, just a list of every plate and what their scale is, what the content is, what the relevant paper size is, stuff like that. Below that, we've got our exports. These are all of our PDFs for pages, things like that. I like to keep most of these things separated out just so that if I do need to replot a packet or a set of things, I don't have to do the entire packet. I can just do that specific file. And then above that, I've got just the main project file where it's everything merged. And these ones aren't for sharing. They're for distribution later on, but you really don't want to have too many people inside of these files reading things just because some of them may be working, others may be not. So just keep these separate from published files. So below that, skipping your olds file, I mean, everybody has it differently. We've got our drafting standards. This is where you'll have project relevant title blocks, scrapbooks for you layout draftsmen, just so that we can share drafting conventions so that all of our plates look the same. We've also got a startup file, and then any show graphics or relevant imagery that may need to be in the title block, just keep those things there, right? Just keeping stuff accessible for relevant people to finish a plate and have everything look consistent. Right, these are drafting standards, so we can all look consistent. Because consistency is key, and if I don't say it enough, then I've said it too little. So here we've just got some brief examples of a layout file. You'll have, or I like to keep, any text-related information like notes or documentation for just text in a text document, something anybody can read and copy out with minimal effort. And then any related media, like if you've got a reference image that you want inside one of the plates for that specific element, you'll want to keep it close by, so just keep it in a folder named XYZ yada yada, but where your main layout file is. And any components that you may have, you'll also want to assign them a relevant tag, so that if you've got a section set up, you can turn off any 3D objects that might be getting in the way of your section, and then turn on a 2D representation of, I think my illustrated example is of a door. Because when we open the SketchUp file in Twinmotion, we'll then have that ability to just turn off that 2D door in favor of our 3D door. And like I said before, we don't have to save out all components. I'm just not 100% sure about how Twinmotion breaks up components versus groups, so I like to just keep things consistent. And if I haven't said this before, don't save raw geometry or don't assign a tag to raw geometry. You want just the component or the group, if you are doing them, to be what the tag is. Just keep in mind that if you explode an object, it will lose that tag, and you'll have to regroup it or recomponent it to then assign it a new tag. Just make sure that you're going through your scenes consistently enough that you're not ruining anybody's viewports anywhere in their layout files versus their SketchUp files, right? Because we're not exporting anything from SketchUp, we're just reading them later on. And if we break or create a new tag somewhere, it may become visible somewhere else, and you might be creating a mess for someone else, but if we're consistent in the way that we're laying things out, the problem will be easy to troubleshoot with minimal time involved. And before we leave layout completely, I just want to touch on that its visualization options. It has a raster, a vector, and a hybrid method. The vector option is the most resource intense. So if you've got a really complicated object geometry-wise, like a really high poly count on a tree, for example, you may want to assign that to a 3D tag and then have a 2D representation that you're floating in somewhere else. Like my lady that I have here as an example, she's actually not a part of the SketchUp file, but she's in my scrapbooks, which has another SketchUp file in it where I keep all of my people that I can then layer in on top of drawings. And you can do this for different scenes from that same SketchUp file in the different rendering formats. Like you can have one layer that's got a bunch of vector drawings in it, and then below that you've got your rastered image, which has graphics from the scene that you're referencing. And then there is a hybrid option. I try to avoid this one just because the results that you get from it tend to be a bit mixed, so I like to play around with the raster and vector and layer them as I need to. And if I haven't said it before, scenes are your viewports or what you're looking at when you're inside of layout. So I think you can never have too many of them. So if you think you're going to need a view for something, make a view for it. And this may also go without saying, but SketchUp and layout really aren't high technical drafting tools. If you really need to get into the complicated weeds of how something needs to look or how something's built, you're probably going to want to go over to AutoCAD or Vectorworks. But that may not even be your job, so who cares? So finally, Twinmotion, after all that, and it's such a small file. Wow. If we've done our work properly, this should actually just be one, or maybe you'll have more than one, main file for your visualization. Right? Because we're only reading component information inside of Twinmotion. We're not actually doing any real design work. We're just visualizing. Because like layout, we're not designing anything. I mean, layout's drafting software. This is more so that we can see what it is that we're looking inside of a realistic environment. So when you're importing these files, I like to do them one at a time and then just place them manually, as opposed to trying to load in a master file, mainly because your computer might crash just depending on how much memory you have. There's a number of different factors as to why not, because show files tend to be pretty big. So go one at a time. It'll help with reloading things later. It makes troubleshooting a lot easier. And you can also turn things on and off as you need to a bit easier so that you can save on processing power when it comes for rendering images or videos or walkthroughs or presentations, whatever it is that you need done. And just because I like to repeat myself, think of it like a traffic light. You've got your hand drawings, which are amazing. That's where you should be doing most of your design work. Then you've got SketchUp above that, where maybe you've got a really good understanding of the program, so you can design in. But then you get to Twinmotion, which is really just for visualizing. Maybe you'll have to move something 2 inches to the left or right, up or down, whatever have you. But then, make a note of it so that somebody can make the proper adjustment in the component or the show file. So when you're importing these, I like to keep my hierarchy just so that, like I said before, we have the ability to turn off any 2D components that we're referencing in our layout file, rather than deleting them in our SketchUp file, only to have our draftsman start secretly plotting our demise. Additionally, something to keep in mind is that when you do keep your hierarchy, all of the objects inside of that component will become selectable. So you'll want to get used to grabbing things from the outliner as opposed to whatever is in front of you that you want to click on. You can still do that, but if you want to move a whole component somewhere, rather than having to select everything that you're looking at visually in the visual portion of Twinmotion, go over to the outliner and find it by name, and then click on that high-level folder so that you can move and rotate and do all the jazz that you would normally need to. Because tags don't transfer over, or at least I haven't seen how they do, if they do, but the name of the component will. And what's nice about doing these things individually is that refresh individual components rather than having to do the whole model. There may be some cases where you'll have to delete that component and all of its related geometry inside of the outliner and then delete it from your importer and then re-import it. But those cases are few and far between, and oftentimes, if you're just changing the height of, let's say, a wall, and you've gone through the effort of saving it in SketchUp, you don't have to re-import it. You can just refresh the object in the importer, and it'll take care of all of that for you. And this goes without saying, but any other changes that you've made as well. So up next, we have applying materials to our objects. You can leverage your material IDs like we had discussed earlier, but there are also other ways of applying materials, like there's object selection, and then there's also the object that we have selected. So below, you see how we have that orange texture in SketchUp, and then we've also got this kind of orange metal inside of Twinmotion. Those two textures aren't the same thing, but because we have assigned it a name in SketchUp, for orange ID, we can then say use orange metal inside of Twinmotion. And then the same thing goes for the green, the blue. We then have that green metal, and then we've also got that blue metal. But if we were doing it by object, then a whole object would turn into whatever material that we had selected. So the whole object would turn orange or green or blue. And then the same thing goes with apply by selection. This just covers anything that we have selected. And then below that, goes over the different ways to project that texture onto the object. We have cubic, which covers the object in a cube or a cylinder or a sphere. And below that we have by UV. And if you remember what I was telling you about the scale of the texture that we applied in SketchUp, like the 4 feet by 4 feet or the 3 feet by 3 feet or the 4 feet by 1, 2 3/4 or change and whatever nonsense that was. If we are doing it by UV, it will take the ratio of the texture in SketchUp and whatever other scale information about that texture that is in SketchUp. So in some cases, you may want to use the cubic, the cylindrical, or the spherical because it gives a more uniform application for things that may have had custom texture put in, or their scale is a bit different. You can avoid any texture warping or scale issues by using those top three rather than using the object's UV. And if we were to use those top three, then we can also reapply any graphic decals that we may have had stored that we had to create a unique texture for in SketchUp, but we can just apply as a graphic inside Twinmotion. So I know I may have just really glossed over or not spent a whole lot of time on each concept, but this is really just to give you an overview of what sort of practices to look out for. Once you really start to do this a lot more, it'll become a lot more fluid, and you'll know what to look for, and you'll know what problems are being caused by what, and you'll be able to solve things at the drop of a hat. Just keep in mind basic file structure, and know that a lot of this isn't necessarily for you, unless you are the only person working on the project, in which case, go nuts, do whatever you want. But it's for your fellow artists to make their jobs just a little bit easier. I know you may want to make yours a little bit easier, but if you take the time to really care about others and how that they're supposed to work, life becomes a lot easier, and there's a lot less hair pulling, and the office or studio doesn't begin to resemble the Thunderdome. And simply by planning ahead, you can create some really visually stunning stuff, even if you never intended to go into layout or Twinmotion. I know the example I have here was something that I only ever did in SketchUp and only ever intended to bring into layout. But because I took the time to organize all of my files and break things up by large elements, I was able to import everything relatively easily and then really focus on the lighting or the position and location of my camera, right? Because this isn't a tool necessarily for design, but for visualization. With that, it's important to also remember that Twinmotion may not necessarily be the best tool for the job, because a lot of renderings out there have a tendency to fall into that kind of uncanny valley where it doesn't quite look right, but it's good enough to illustrate the idea, but because it looks so a bit off, sometimes the idea doesn't sell correctly or land with that visual impact that you need to get an idea across. And set your view sets up first before you start positioning all your cameras and setting your render settings. It'll help later on when you're moving stuff around, and so that you don't accidentally crash Twinmotion when you go to move an object 2 inches to the left, but you're in the ray trace setting. So that'll bring us to the end of the presentation. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. I know there's a forum on my site under my About Me page. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, leave a comment below. I'll try and read through them. I'm sorry, I'm not the best. Feel free to leave a like. Don't really bother subscribing. I'm not sure if I'm going to make more of these. And please don't be intimidated by this process. I know it can seem fairly scary. There's a lot to go over, but if you practice with it and just kind of get into the habit of going through the motions, then it becomes a lot easier. And with that, that's the end. Have a good day, and be nice to one another.